services wherever practical. So their MTR doesn't make any sense at all. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, this week offers a true contrast between two visions for how to fuel our economy and to build manufacturing jobs. One vision was laid out by the President earlier this week.
House will come to order. Gentleman may continue. Gentleman may continue.
While we are currently in the midst of a transformation in the way we produce American energy cleanly, affordably, abundantly, and responsibly through the use of new and improving technology, how does the administration respond? By declaring a war on coal and picking winners and losers in energy production, both of which have been an assault on job creators, especially for American manufacturing. Even as we've been debating this bill, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have responded by attempting to drown offshore production with more regulations and declarations that make it more difficult to achieve energy independence by 2020, thus killing tens of thousands of American jobs that could be created. But, Mr. Speaker, there is another vision of how we can energize America through the responsible production of our resources and create American jobs. That vision does not include ill-advised regulations that ignore the effects. Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
Gentleman's correct. House will come to order. Gentleman may continue.
That vision does not include the ill-advised regulations that ignore the effects on the pocketbooks of hardworking American families. It does not include programs where political appointees and bureaucrats can decide who can and cannot produce energy at the expense of hardworking taxpayer dollars. And most importantly, it does not include administrative attempts to implement a backdoor cap-and-trade regime to fulfill the President's original goal where electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. This new vision, our vision, builds off of what the private sector has done in revolutionizing how oil and gas can be produced. It takes stock of what laws this Congress has passed and the regulations this administration has promulgated. And then we ask ourselves, what can we do to make America truly energy independent? And what can we do to make it easier for job creators to actually create jobs that grow healthy American families? This House is working to achieve this vision now, offering solutions to take advantage of the innovative, job-creating, and cost-reducing energy resurgence that is going across our America to fuel the next generation of American manufacturing. We have passed hydropower bills out of this House. We have passed the popular Keystone XL pipeline bill. And today we will pass a bill for responsible energy production offshore. And this is just the beginning. This House, through the leadership of my good friend from Washington, Chairman Doc Hastings, will continue to bring bills through committee and to the House floor that will embrace American resources and that will get the government out of the way of producing them. Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
Gentleman's correct. House will come to order. Gentleman may continue.
By producing American energy, we are just starting. We must harness these same technological advances to achieve even greater economic opportunity and job creation through the distribution of this energy, and most importantly, creating an environment where we can start making things in America again. We know that the cost of energy is one of the most important factors to determine where plants are built and if jobs are created. So we know that cheaper energy means higher paying American jobs. I often see my colleagues on the other side of the aisle on this floor with a big sign that says, "Make it in America." We agree. So instead of standing next to a slogan or getting behind the same rhetoric as the President, I urge my colleagues to work toward a vision of jobs and energy security and a greater standard of living that all Americans are desperately seeking. This is how we really take action for our kids as compared to the empty rhetoric of the White House. The American people want us to create a results-oriented solutions set of what America can do. Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
Correct. House will come to order. Gentleman may continue.
The American people want us to create a results-oriented solutions of what we can do, not the tired liberal rhetoric of what America can't do. We will not sit idly by as the President lays down his vision of new regulations, producing uncertainty for American energy workers and American families that would stamp back our nation's energy and economic revolution. Remember the results of the President's last energy plan. Number one, greatly reduced offshore areas and public lands. Number two, programs like Solyndra, where he invested $26 billion of money from hardworking taxpayers to produce only 2,300 jobs at a cost of $11.5 million a job. The shutdown of 20% of our coal-fired electricity generation and the loss of paychecks for thousands of American families. His latest energy plan is more the same type of action that he wants to destroy the futures of our kids and grandkids. Mr. Speaker, we will work toward energy security, and I urge the no vote on the MTR and a yes vote on the underlying reservation.
Gentleman's time expired. With that objection, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the motion to recommit. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. The noes have it. The motion fails.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 8 and Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 5-minute vote on the motion to recommit will be followed by 5-minute votes on passage of the bill if ordered and approval of the journal if ordered. This is a 5-minute vote.
This is the Democratic motion to recommit on a bill that would expand oil and gas drilling, a bill that would direct the Interior Secretary to implement a 5-year oil and gas leasing program off the Atlantic and Pacific, including areas like California, South Carolina, and Virginia. The motion to recommit by Democrat Representative Schneider of Illinois would affirm that the current law prohibition on the issuance of permits or leases for new oil and gas drilling in the Great Lakes, it would continue that prohibition in the Great Lakes area. This is the motion to recommit. Final passage vote is next. And again, for some details on the bill itself, we spoke to a Capitol Hill reporter. Amy Harder is energy and environment reporter with National Journal Daily. Why has the Obama administration issued a veto threat against this House offshore drilling bill?
This legislation the House is going to be voting on is very similar to the bill that the House Republicans have pushed in the prior Congress, which is to open up areas on the offshore of the United States to oil and natural gas drilling that the administration does not want to open. And so the administration predictably has issued a veto threat to this bill, but the Republicans keep pushing it because it is a salient political message for both the campaign season and because it's something their members like.
What are some of the areas that this bill would open up?
This bill would open up different areas of the Gulf of Mexico, on the California coast, and the eastern shore of the United States. Depending on which part of the United States, the years differ a little bit, but most of them are done by about 2020.
And any idea of what the volume, how much energy, how much oil and gas are these new fields supposed to yield?
The Republicans like to point out that it could significantly increase how much oil we produce in the United States. But something that I attended a briefing with the House Majority Whip Kevin McCarthy, who is involved with this bill, along with the sponsor, House Natural Resources Chairman Doc Hastings. They talk a lot about how this can really help the jobs and the energy security of the United States. But what they don't talk about, which is one of the biggest oil developments in the country, is a lot of the oil in North Dakota. And this is just one more piece of the pie that they think can help us get closer to energy independence.
And what are Democrats in the House arguing against the bill?
They're arguing that it's moving forward drastically with drilling that ignores the environmental impacts of this drilling. It's one of those debates that we've seen time and time again, and you're seeing the Democrats in the House miles and miles apart from the Republicans in the House. And they have this debate over and over again because energy, and specifically drilling, is one of the few issues that the House Republican Conference is very united upon. And so it's easy for Speaker Boehner to move these bills because he knows it will unite his conference, unlike some issues such as immigration and the Farm Bill.
Well, the bill comes on the heels of President Obama's major speech Tuesday on the environment and energy regulations. Your National Journal article headline said that the Republicans are answering Obama with a drilling bill, and in that article you point out the president saying we don't have time for a meeting of the Flat Earth Society. What's the president's point in this?
The president is saying that the science behind climate change, that the fact the humans' consumption of fossil fuels is exacerbating climate change with a rise in greenhouse gas emissions is so compelling that it demands action immediately. And yet the Republicans in the House are pretty blind to this science, and so they're moving forward somewhat ironically a day after the president announced this climate change plan with these more ambitious drilling plans. And it's further evidence of how far apart President Obama and a lot of the Democratic Party is with the Republicans in the House and also many Republicans in the Senate.
Will the drilling bill pass in the House?
It will definitely pass. You will hear the debates on the floor about the potential job creation for more drilling, and then the Democrats concerned about environmental degradation of the land. But once again, like most drilling bills in the House, it will be dead on arrival in the Senate. Although I will say that one portion of the bill, which would increase revenue sharing for offshore states to be able to take some of the money that the oil companies pay in royalties to the federal government so that the states can have a piece of that pie, that idea has gained traction in the Senate with Senator Murkowski and Senator Landrieu, a Democrat from Louisiana and a Republican from Alaska.
Amy Harder is energy and environment reporter for National Journal. You can follow her stories at nationaljournal.com. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And the administration on Wednesday issued their statement of administration policy, a veto threat in that, saying that the bill would, quote, establish unworkable deadlines and substantive and procedural limitations on important environmental review. That from the White House. This is the motion to recommit. Final passage on the drilling bill is next. The House will wrap up work for the week and ahead of the July 4th recess. Late yesterday, five-term Republican Representative John Campbell of California announced that he will retire at the end of his term, citing his desire to start a new chapter in his life after 14 years in elected office. Roll Call writes that he was first elected to Congress in a 2005 special election to replace former Representative Christopher Cox, a Republican who resigned then to become chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Ayes are 190.
Mr. Moran of Virginia. Mr. Moran of Virginia votes aye. Ms. Pelosi. Ms. Pelosi votes aye. Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Grijalva votes aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 195.
Ms. Herrera Butler. Ms. Herrera Butler votes no.
On this vote, the yeas are 195, the nays are 225, one voting present. The motion is not adopted. The question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The ayes have it. The bill is passed. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Going to ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring recorded vote will rise. Sufficient number having risen. Recorded vote is ordered. Members record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.
Final passage on a bill that would expand offshore oil and gas drilling by opening up new areas for leasing. And this will about wrap it up for the House this week ahead of the July 4th recess. Both the House and Senate returning on Monday, July the 8th. The Senate finishing up their work yesterday, passing their immigration bill by a vote of 68 to 32. President Obama on his Africa trip is pressing the House to take up immigration legislation when they return. The Associated Press reporting the White House says the president called House Speaker John Boehner and House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi to urge them to have the House act on an overhaul of immigration law. He made the call while traveling in Africa, and the call, the White House saying he told both leaders that immigration is a priority for him.
On this vote, the yeas are 235 yeas, 186 nays. The bill is passed. Without objection, the motion to recommit is tabled. Motion to reconsider is tabled.
Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker?
Pursuant to Clause 8, Rule 20 of the unfinished business, in the question on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the Journal, which the Chair will put de novo. The question is on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the Journal. Those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the Journal is approved. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that in the engrossment of the bill H.R. 2231, the clerk is authorized to make technical corrections and conforming changes to the bill.
Without objection, so ordered.
Okay.
Have a good Fourth, Mr. Chair.
The Chair will now entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek to be recognized? Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Student loan rates are set to double on Monday. It's been a month since the House passed the Smarter Solutions for Students Act that would stop this doubling of rates. At a time when we need to restore people's faith in government, the Senate adjourned last night and failed to prevent this from happening. This is extremely harmful to the students in Illinois and across the nation. Student loan rates should not be held hostage by members of Congress to advance their own political agendas. The House Solutions takes Washington politics out of the equation and is a long-term fix that moves student loans to a market-based interest rate. It even echoes the President's plan. Speaking to students in my district, I've heard their concerns about the rising cost of education. Jenny, a student from Batavia, told me that she would like to expand on the education she has received at Northern Illinois University, but is already concerned about loan payments when she graduates. She's not alone. This is a crisis that will further cripple our economy's recovery. I call on the President to step up and provide leadership needed. Let's urge the Senate to act, join the House, and take Washington politics out of students' wallets and stand up for tomorrow's recovery. I yield back.
The Chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has passed H.R. 324 to grant the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the 1st Special Service Force in recognition of its superior service during World War II.
What purpose does this gentlewoman from Florida rise? Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am so pleased today to recognize a remarkable high school student who was recently named the Young Entrepreneur of the Year by the National Federation of Independent Business. At age 14, Shay Good made a cheesecake that caused a sensation in her neighborhood. One cheesecake led to another, and Shay's Bakery was born in Delray, Florida. Today, Shay is a successful small business owner and a standout student, balancing calculus and chemistry at Spanish River High School with measuring cups and mixing bowls at her bakery. Headed to college at Washington University this fall, we cannot wait to see the next great step for this young entrepreneur's career. Congratulations, Shay, on your well-deserved recognition. You've made your family and community proud, and we wish you the very best. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back the balance for time. For purposes of the gentleman from Arkansas rise.
I seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to advise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered. Yeah, sure.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to welcome the newest member of the Womack family, the birth of Caden Houston Womack, late yesterday. He's the son of Philip and Kaylee, the grandson of Kathy Vance and Earl Vance, and Steve and Terry Womack. At 5 pounds and 10 ounces, Caden entered this world completely oblivious to the difficult and complex issues facing our nation and indeed the world. Like every newborn in America, Caden should have a clear path to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But, Mr. Speaker, we all know that instead he inherits about $50,000 worth of debt that he had absolutely nothing to do with its creation. That's a challenge we must overcome. It's simply unacceptable, downright irresponsible for these innocent babies to face growing up in a country not responsible for its extravagance. This grandpa is grateful Caden was born to good personal health, and this grandpa will continue to do his part in Congress to ensure a bright and sustainable future for his generation. To my newest grandson, welcome, Caden. Happy birthday. And I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California rise? Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member of the Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition and the Safe Climate Caucus, I rise to call for urgent congressional action on climate change. This week, President Obama released a climate action plan, and while it makes important steps toward reversing the trend on carbon pollution, congressional action is necessary to get the job done. Climate change continues to affect our communities through severe events like extreme heat, floods, and superstorms. For so many African Americans and communities of color, the impact of climate change is real and present. They bear the brunt of the effects of pollution, toxic dump sites, and greenhouse gas emissions, leading to higher rates of asthma and a greater vulnerability to natural disasters. Yet instead of working with Democrats to address climate change and promote job creation, Republicans voted on a bill to expand unsafe drilling and make big oil even bigger. That is exactly the wrong approach. Domestic energy production is already booming. The American people are waiting for real action on climate issues. We owe it to our children and future generations to act now on climate change.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise?
Mr. Speaker, we request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, Emily Whitehead is a young girl from Phillipsburg, Center County, Pennsylvania. Emily wants to be a veterinarian when she grows up, and she loves riding and her dog Lucy. At the age of 5, Emily was diagnosed with leukemia. She worked through multiple different treatments. Unfortunately, in 2011, she relapsed. Emily received chemotherapy for months and was scheduled for a bone marrow transplant in 2012, but she relapsed just 2 weeks before the transplant date. Unable to get back into remission, doctors told Emily's parents there were no options left. The family decided to take a chance. They traveled across the state to enroll her in a clinical trial at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Emily would be the first child in the world to receive modified trained cells, or T cells, to fight her cancer. By May of 2012, Emily was in remission. The treatment had worked. I want to thank Emily and her family for making it to Capitol Hill last week. This body needed to hear your story and about the medical research and innovation that saved Emily's life. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back to balance my time.
Thank you. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio rise? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to remind us that on Tuesday, the Supreme Court struck down a critical part of the Voting Rights Act. Some would say the heart of that act. I also remind us that it was almost 50 years ago that President Johnson echoed across this Congress and this nation for us to open our polling places to all people, to allow all men and women, regardless of their skin color, to be able to vote, to extend the rights to vote to every citizen in this land. Because as he so eloquently stated, that this was not a constitutional issue. So I ask this Congress this year to express our discontentment with what has happened to the Voting Rights Act through the Supreme Court. Thank you, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, there were 56 of them. They pledged their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor in the signing of the document that proclaimed that all people are endowed by their Creator with certain absolute rights: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And governments are instituted to preserve those rights. It was Philadelphia. It was July 4th, 1776. It was the Declaration of Independence. Then after 8 years of war, this rabble, as the British called the colonists, defeated King George III. We went our own way. Independence, I like the sound of that word, means that we, the people, have rule over government, and government will be our servant rather than us being government's serf. Liberty, freedom, independence. These three noble words are a reality in this, the greatest of all nations. As a son of the American Revolution, I thank the patriots that gave us independence. So, Mr. Speaker, next week, on this special day, fly the flag, listen to the band play Stars and Stripes Forever, and thank the good Lord for shedding His grace on the United States of America. And that's just the way it is.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas arise?
To address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, none of us get to where we are by ourselves. I was very proud to see the former chairperson of the Financial Services Committee, Chairperson Frank, who is no longer with Congress, not only address DOMA, but he also addressed Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act by way of Section 4 and the importance of it. Human rights are birthrights. They are rights that courts can recognize, they should not deny. What the court did with DOMA was correct. I support the dignity of human beings to have equal opportunities in the greatest country in the world. I thank Chairman Frank, and I want him to know that he stands with us, and I stand with him, and I stand with all persons who are being discriminated against in an invidious way. Human rights cannot be denied because they are birthrights. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Speaker, 1 minute to unanimous consent. Thank you.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, this Sunday marks the 4th year since Sergeant Bo Bergdahl was reported missing in action in Afghanistan. It's on this sober occasion that veterans and concerned citizens across the United States will appeal to their government, asking those that have the means to find every unaccounted soldier, airman, sailor, Marine, or Guardsman and bring them home. Currently, less than 1% of the American population serves in the armed forces at any time. Through their sacrifices, great many Americans are not touched by this on a personal level because so few of our members serve. The men and women that step between us and those that would harm us are young, but they're brave and they are strong. So it's easy to forget that they are so young, filled with ambition, passion, honor, a full life ahead of them with unrestrained potential. Our troops are children of concerned parents. Many of them are also parents of scared children. And that collective fear is endured by every family left behind. When a war fighter does not come home, when they are held captives or their whereabouts are unknown, the strain on loved ones is unbearable. All 3 of my sons are highly capable and well-trained soldiers, but every time they deploy, I worry about when they're away. Mr. Speaker, I ask that those here remember Sergeant Bo Bergdahl. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Connecticut rise?
Request permission to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend.
Without objection.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2 days at midnight, by law, the interest rates for the subsidized Stafford student loan program will double from 3.4% to 6.8%, raising interest rates for 7.5 million college students at exactly the time they are taking out loans for next fall's semester. What a terrible statement about this Congress that we failed to move forward with legislation to protect those rates. My legislation, H.R. 1595, which had 195 discharge signatures, would have protected that rate. Again, the leadership of this House turned a deaf ear and insisted that their bill, passed on May 23rd, somehow protected those college students. Well, the Congressional Budget Office looked at that bill that passed that day, and they concluded that that bill was worse than doing nothing and allowing the rates to double to 6.8%. It is, again, a bill which will put kids into a variable rate system that over time we know will be higher than 6.8%. The disgust that America will feel on July 1st when they see that a critical need, higher education, was overlooked and ignored, on top of failure to turn off sequester, pass the Farm Bill. It is time for this Congress to act, protect the lower interest rates for America's college students. I yield back.
The Chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leave of absence requested for Mr. Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania for today.
Without objection, the request is granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy January 3rd, 2013, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield as much time as he may consume to my dear friend from Texas, Mr. Flores.
I thank Mr. Gohmert for yielding a few minutes to me for a very special few minutes. Mr. Speaker, on June 8th, America lost Army Lieutenant Colonel Todd Clark in the War on Terror. Lieutenant Colonel Clark was killed in action during an attack at an Army base in Afghanistan. Lieutenant Colonel Todd Clark was a native of New York. He attended college in Texas, and his father, Jack, was also an Army colonel. Todd was in junior ROTC while in high school, and upon graduation he attended Texas A&M University, where he joined Company B-2 of the Corps of Cadets. At the time of his tragic death, he was a brigade-level supervisor for the 10th Mountain Division. During his Army career, he would serve on 5 separate deployments in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. During his 17 years of service to our country, Lieutenant Colonel Clark earned many awards and decorations, including the following: 3 Bronze Star Medals, the Purple Heart, 2 Meritorious Service Medals, the Army Commendation with Combat Distinguishing Device V, 4 Army Commendation Medals, 3 Army Achievement Medals, the Army Reserve Components Achievement Medal, the National Defense Service Medal with Bronze Service Star, the Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal, the Kosovo Campaign Medal with Bronze Service Star, 2 Afghanistan Campaign Medals with Bronze Service Star, 4 Iraq Campaign Medals with Bronze Service Star, the Global War on Terrorism Expeditionary Medal, the Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, the Korean Defense Service Medal, the Army Service Ribbon, 3 Overseas Service Ribbons, the NATO Medal Kosovo, the NATO Medal Combat Action Badge, and the Basic Parachutist Badge. At the conclusion of his current tour, Lieutenant Colonel Clark's next assignment was to come back to Texas. He was thrilled to be chosen to be the executive officer, or essentially the second in command, of the Corps of Cadets ROTC program at his alma mater, Texas A&M University. On Friday, June 21st, Lieutenant Colonel Todd Clark was laid to rest at the Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery in San Antonio, Texas. Our thoughts and prayers are with the family and friends of Lieutenant Colonel Clark. He will be forever remembered as an outstanding soldier, husband, and father. We thank him and his family for their service and sacrifice for our country. His sacrifice reflects the words of Jesus in John 15:13, where Jesus said, "Greater love hath no man than this, than a man who will lay down his life for his friends." I ask that everyone remember to pray often for our country during these difficult times. Please pray for our military men and women who protect us from threats abroad, and please pray for our first responders who protect us from threats here at home. God bless our military men and women, and God bless America. And thank you. I yield back to my good friend from Texas, Mr. Gohmert.
Thank you, Mr. Flores. Colonel Clark was a great American. He was a great Aggie. He was just a great man, and I appreciate that tribute to him. Now, my friend from Texas, from Houston area, had wished to do a 1 minute, but I'll yield to my friend from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for such time as she may consume.
I want to thank my colleague from Texas, and I want to thank him publicly for his commitment to the United States military. and certainly for work that we collaborated on to work with a young soldier. We are always interested in making sure that our soldiers and their families have justice and access to justice. So thank you, Congressman, for your leadership on that issue. Let me thank you for the brief time that I will utilize today and to indicate that I am so proud to be an American, and I wish America, as we celebrate our birthday, that we become even more unified, more grateful of the red, white, and blue, and to take that day even to acknowledge our public servants, first responders, to acknowledge the men and women who serve in government, local governments, to those who serve in the United States government, and to particularly take every day and have an opportunity to celebrate those who are in uniform on this soil or places beyond. Let us congratulate them. And that causes me to indicate that the Voter Rights Act was a part of America. Many people are not aware that this Congress, with 398 votes plus in the House and 98 votes in the Senate, reauthorized a bill that really means the right to vote for everyone. We take our instruction from the Supreme Court seriously, and what we will intend to do is seek a bipartisan effort to strengthen and to ensure that no vote is denied. I do express great disappointment in the immediacy of the implementation of the Texas voter ID law and pray for the spiritual community to come together and pray for this Congress, which we will do on this coming Sunday, June 30th. We will pray for the Congress in Houston, and I ask that we pray across America that we'll have the opportunity to do this very challenging effort together. For the question of voting rights is not one of color. It is one of the freedom of this nation. I also want to add the recognition that all marriages are equal and free, and we ask that those who have been so positively impacted by the decision that the Supreme Court issued on DOMA likewise will continue to now recognize their freedom to find that marriage is a respect of all. Let me conclude by raising this question so that you can see the reality of what the Voting Rights Act stands for. A casualty, an immediate casualty of the elimination of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and when I say that, its enforcement provision 4, was the closing of the last African-American minority school district. 50 years of history, teachers and workers and police officers and students who graduated and came back to contribute, the North Forest Independent School District, on the very day that the Supreme Court decision was rendered, they had been in court ready to be protected by the Voting Rights Act. But now 7 trustees, of which this community voted for, cherished, were eliminated on that Tuesday because of the undermining of the Voter Rights Act. But as a human factor, students who love teachers, teachers who love students, teachers fired, doors locked, administrators thrown out, to no fault of their own. They had progress. They had, as many of us had, years of some unfortunate history, but look at them now. But because of the unfortunate history, the whole district, the community, the homes, the people who have invested in this school district. Now, as I leave this podium to my good friend, I have to face school teachers and others who are cut off from any form of health care, individuals who are on dialysis, kidney issues, of course, that they have, diabetes. They are shut off, doors locked, papers thrown out, no ability to give recommendations for teachers. What a dastardly circumstance. I'm prayerful that I can go to the Commissioner of Education to ask for a pause so that these individuals can continue their health insurance, so that mothers and fathers can get their students in regular order into another school system, and so that we can find common ground just out of our own humanity. I want to thank my colleague for yielding, and I am prayerful as I leave this podium, that one, America will commemorate its great holiday together on July 4th, and that when we come back, this Congress will expeditiously move to restore the anchor in the name of John Lewis, who shed his blood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, who has continued to be a peacemaker in this Congress, that we reauthorize this wonderful legislative initiative so that incidences like North Forest Independent School District and others that have fallen victim to now this non-enforceability of the Voting Rights Act can be restored, and we come together as a great and wonderful nation. I thank the gentleman, and I yield back.
I thank my friend from Texas, and Mr. Speaker, was quite impressed and pleased to work with Ms. Jackson-Lee in our effort in helping one of our servicemen. Some people around the country say, why can't people get along on both sides of the aisle? When we disagree on issues, we say that. But when we work together because of our common goal to make the country better and to help those who have been unfairly treated, we work together, and it's a pleasure to do so. So I thank my friend from Texas, Ms. Jackson-Lee. And I would like to comment today on the good that the Voting Rights Act did. Back in the 1960s, there was racial disparity. There was far too many African Americans who, percentage-wise, were not voting when compared with majority Euro, white Americans, and something needed to be done. And the Supreme Court said, because there has been such impropriety, then we will allow this punitive measure to try to force things into being right, where there's not racial disparity, racial discrimination in preventing people of minority races from getting to the polls and being able to vote. Nearly 50 years later, over 45 years later, it has worked. It has worked. As the Supreme Court pointed out, of the original 6 states, 5 of those states have less racial disparity in voting than the whole rest of the country. That's great progress. But over those 4 to 5 decades of time, things change. And the Voting Rights Act, as I pointed out to my friend and fellow Republican chairman of the Judiciary at the time, Mr. Sensenbrenner, who had worked so hard to have it extended previously and was working on the reauthorization or the re-extension, and to my friend across the aisle that I have great respect for. We have wonderful conversations, Mr. John Conyers. As I pointed out, you have a problem with equal protection in this extension. You are punishing states who have cleaned up their act. Now, I don't know of anybody in any of those states who were forced under the 40-plus-year-old formula to be punished who had anybody in their government who was there when racial inequality and discrimination was going on, who's still there. So this act that had done great good refused to acknowledge that good had been done, and even though things had changed and we had gone from southern states having racial discrimination to now having those southern states that had less racial disparity, and in fact in numerous cases had more African American turnout than they had white turnout percentage-wise. So things had corrected themselves. I would submit it won't totally be corrected until we have a much higher percentage of all Americans that are eligible to vote coming out and voting, because that's what's supposed to happen. But anyway, things had changed, and now the most discriminatory state in the Union, ironically, had become Massachusetts. And even Wisconsin has a district with significant racial disparity, indicating potential for discrimination in that area, and that perhaps Massachusetts should be an area that we focus on for trying to eliminate the racial discrimination there. Let's look at the numbers, see where racial disparity exists, determine what the reason is, and if there's racial discrimination, we need to address that. Because as we've seen, the Voting Rights Act had actually done a great good. So it's a work in progress. And I don't know how many of the 2 senators and representatives from Massachusetts would be willing to join with me to agree to put Massachusetts under the punitive Section 5, but I'm certainly willing to go along and do that so that Massachusetts can benefit and get rid of racial discrimination and work toward the day when their racial disparity is back in line with where it should be. It's normally been a forward-thinking state, and so it's very sad that it's regressed in that regard, but certainly we can work together on helping improve Massachusetts to the point that, say, Texas is now. I know they would like to be. I know people in Massachusetts that do not want to be the most racially discriminating state, so I'm sure it shouldn't be that difficult of a thing to accomplish. So there should be a tribute to the Voting Rights Act. And I happen to represent East Texas. Nacogdoches paper, after the vote on Voting Rights Act, had unfairly said, that I was a throwback to Democrats in the 50s because they had not bothered to read my floor speeches to see my my own Gohmert amendment that would have required a formula that would apply across the country so that the act would apply to everywhere in the country. That was a fair thing to do. And I voted for the amendment if we had been able to get the Gohmert amendment in, but it was not accepted. So I knew the act would have to go down. Anyway, the great thing about being in East Texas, most people there are quite fair. And when it was pointed out to the Nacogdoches paper back then, my speech and my amendment, then they did a retraction and corrected themselves. So that's the great thing about America. Now, I'm not expecting the AP to do a correction and the misrepresentation of things that I said this week. And in fact, I'm quite tickled that after the AP experienced the full force of the executive branch coming after them, grabbing their records, grabbing phone records from up here in the area in which the reporters work and make calls to congressmen and other things. What a violation. What an atrocious violation of the AP's rights. And I'm glad that the AP doesn't feel like they owe me any obligation of being more accurate in their reporting of me. This is America. The AP is totally free to mess up stories as they wish, totally free to slant stories as they want to. That's their prerogative, the great thing about America. But I hope that they'll start being a little more vigilant about the abuses by this administration, since now they have been the victim of such abuses. We'll see. But hopefully they won't continue to be so defensive for the administration and be a little more objective in their reporting. I did want to address the Windsor decision regarding the Defense of Marriage Act, because as a former prosecutor, a former judge, had been a litigator, and a former Chief Justice, I read these opinions with interest and look for the reasoning, look for the consistency in the citation of the facts, the recitation to prior law, prior precedent, and the reasoning of the court. And as I read through this Windsor decision regarding the Defense of Marriage Act, I was very concerned as I read through. They go through here in the majority opinion, Justice Kennedy wrote, they got about 12 pages here where they're talking about, most of the discussion is about standing. Because under this case, the administration refused to do their job. They refused to have the Department of Justice defend the law, and it shouldn't be any surprise. I mean, the President goes out, including here recently, and says, I don't like the law that Congress passed and prior presidents have signed, so here's the new law. And recently, the last few days, he didn't like the law as it stands on carbon issues. So, as any good monarch would do, he just came up with a new law and espoused that. Unfortunately, it's not appropriate, and the Constitution has the wherewithal to stop this kind of overreach and unconstitutional activity by a president that just refuses to enforce laws in being, creates new laws out of whole cloth while ignoring the laws that are in place. That's a problem. The founders recognized that it's possible someday some president, some administration could do that, and if they do, then the Congress has the powers of the purse, and they can step up and say, you're abusing the Constitution, you're abusing people's rights, and therefore we as a House and Senate refuse to fund any department that is acting extra-constitutionally. We have the power to do that. I have people here in my party, the majority party in the House, say, you know, we've got no leverage. Are you kidding? There is no body in this entire government, in the whole executive branch, that can get paid, that can have any money to do their jobs, unless we vote to allow them to have money from the Treasury. They can't get it. We have that authority. And if we wanted to take a hard line when the Justice Department is refusing to investigate matters properly, they're covering up matters, they come to Congress and misrepresent things, we have the power to stop them from continuing such abuses. When they potentially commit a fraud on the court and say somebody is a criminal like James Rosen, and they swear to that before a judge and swear that he's a flight risk when apparently they knew all along he wasn't, and now they say, no, 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 they were never going to prosecute. We have the power to stop that kind of stuff. We have the power to stop the abuses of going after the AP or Rosen or any reporters inappropriately and abusing and breaching the freedom of the press. Saw my friend Mr. Nadler walk across the back of the hall. We have disagreed on so many things, but I have come to appreciate very much his position on the need to hold every administration accountable, and I'm hoping that we're going to be able to work out some legislation that reins in the abuses. Yes, I know that an administration needs to monitor some things, but I'm quite concerned about the extent to which this administration has moved even farther than the prior administration in monitoring people. I mean, basically in such an incredibly Orwellian fashion that it's a little scary to those of us that have watched this happen. So I'm hoping we'll be able to work together. When you look at this opinion and you see, well, gee, the administration was refusing to defend a law that was duly passed, signed into law by President Clinton, it's a problem. Somebody has to defend the law. And I was grateful that the Supreme Court, after they analyze this and get over around page 12 or so, and say, that similarly, with respect to the legislative power, this is on page 12 of the majority opinion, when Congress has passed a statute and a president has signed it, it poses grave challenges to the separation of powers for the executive at a particular moment to be able to nullify Congress's enactment solely on its own initiative and without any determination from a court. Of course, then they go through and say on page 13, they refer to the bilateral legislative group that decided to defend the Defense of Marriage Act when the administration refused to do the job that was required constitutionally. They refused to defend it, and as they have other laws that have been duly passed and signed. But the court says, in part, which is one of immediate importance to the federal government and to hundreds of thousands of persons. Well, they had no basis, in fact, to make that reference, but as we've seen, particularly in recent years, the court has strayed off into areas where they do not have facts to justify their opinions, and they make bad decisions, as they did in the horrendous Dred Scott case. It happens when the court becomes the fact finder, the basically judge, jury, and executioner. I mean, they just seem to want to do it all and make references to facts that are not before the court. And in fact, they say these circumstances support the court's decision to proceed on the merits. So the court's saying, okay, the administration refuses to do their constitutional job to defend duly passed and signed legislation, so the members of Congress that passed this law, that pushed it through and voted for it, in essence, they will have standing to defend it. So it took them a long time to get here, clear over to 13, but they eventually say, okay, we will recognize that since these people passed the law, they pushed it through, it's their group that got it passed and made it into a law, we'll recognize that they have a legitimate standing to come before this court and defend the law. And now, basically, the court says, now that we've found that the people that passed this law have a right to defend it, significant enough that they have standing, that gives us jurisdiction as a Supreme Court, and so now we will proceed on the merits. So then they go through and they analyze, and I had some trouble with some of their representations. You know, King Solomon, many, including me, believe was the wisest man who ever lived. Of course, then he had too many wives, and that always mess up anybody's wisdom. But he was wise at the time he said, there is nothing new under the sun. Well, the Supreme Court, apparently at least the new Holy Quintet, believes they're wiser than Solomon, even though they show some ignorance. They say here, page 13, for marriage between a man and a woman, no doubt, had been thought of by most people as essential to the very definition of that term and to its role and function throughout the history of civilization. Now, parenthetically, I'd like to insert, that shows some wisdom that they would make that comment, and throughout the history of mankind, though many won't acknowledge it, marriage between a man and a woman coming together, or as the Bible says, a man will leave his mother and a woman will leave her home, and the two will come together and be one person, one flesh. That's been recognized as a good, healthy building block for a society. And that's been recognized throughout the history of the United States as a good, healthy building block. And what some seem to not recognize, even though they acknowledge they believe in evolution and how a species evolves by having better and more adaptable offspring, and the strongest produce more and better offspring that evolve the species to a higher level. Interestingly, throughout the history of mankind, it apparently was not the joinder of a man and a man or a woman and a woman that was able to produce a better and more evolved species, from best we can tell, until you still need a sperm from a man, an egg from a woman. Even if you say, well, yeah, we can clone, if you don't have something that was created by the joinder of something from a man and something from a woman, then you have nothing to clone. So as smart as we think we are, it still comes back to what the Bible says as the two people becoming one person, one flesh. And anyway, the court says, and I quote, "That belief for many who long have held it became even more urgent, more cherished when challenged. For others, however, came the beginnings of a new perspective, a new insight." There is nothing new under the sun. This kind of assertion has been made, and it's often found toward the end of great civilizations. It doesn't bring about the end of the civilization, but it's often found at the end of a great civilization as basically a mile marker that a civilization passes on the way to the dustbin of history. No nation lasts forever. None does this country want. But it's my hope and prayer that we can at least double the length of the short time that this country has existed since 1775, when the war started, the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So anyway, the Supreme Court talks about this new perspective and new insight. And then they say this: the limitation of lawful marriage to heterosexual couples, which for centuries had been deemed both necessary and fundamental, came to be seen in New York and certain other states as an unjust exclusion. And they go on and they mention, there are 11 states that had adopted this. There are not 11 states that have had the entire state vote to recognize marriage between two men or two women. But once you move marriage beyond the scope of a man and a woman, you really don't end up with a good place to put a limit. Because now that the court has pushed this boundary out there and eliminated it, then I think polygamy is wrong, bigamy is wrong, and it's a crime in many places. But how will that be justifiable, even though I believe it's wrong? How will that be justifiable now that the court has removed this? There's some believe polygamy is the way to go. I do not think it's healthy overall for a society. And I certainly don't think it helped Solomon. And I think it helped him lose his wisdom. But the court goes on and says this, page 16, "and its operation is directed to a class of persons that the laws of New York and of 11 other states have sought to protect." And again, that's not 11 or 12 states that have had the entire state vote on what marriage is. That's that many states that have, most of those have been legislatures. And in some states where legislatures have said one thing, the people came back of the whole state and said, "You're not representing our interests, and we're a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and therefore we're correcting you and fixing the law." The court says at page 17, "The definition of marriage is the foundation of the state's broader authority to regulate the subject of domestic relations with respect to the protection of offspring, property interests, and the enforcement of marital responsibilities. The states at the time of the adoption of the Constitution possess full power over the subject of marriage and divorce, and the Constitution delegated no authority to the government of the United States on the subject of marriage and divorce." So if you've read plenty of opinions and you read that at page 17, you realize this court is about to do what for many of us is unthinkable, become a holy quintet, the 5 justices, and basically try to rewrite the laws of nature. and nature's God, as most of the founders believed. But as I read that, and I had not read the Proposition 8 case from the Supreme Court regarding California's law, I thought, well, I don't like where this is going, but based on this reasoning, I know the Supreme Court will have to be intellectually honest and consistent enough that since they've said members of Congress that passed a law have standing to defend that law when the Attorney General of the Executive Branch doesn't, they'll have to uphold the standing of the group in California who pushed through and voted for and passed, just as Congress does the laws here, through referendum, the law in California saying that marriage was between a man and a woman. And when I read this, uh-oh, this doesn't sound good for the Defense of Marriage Act by the federal Congress, because they're saying it's only the states that can decide what marriage is, and these 11, 12 states have decided for themselves what it is, and so the federal government doesn't have any power to say what it is. I still contend the federal government does have a nexus and power to say what it is for purposes of certain federal benefits, but the court, as the new Holy Quintet saw otherwise. And anyway, they go on to say in this opinion what shows that the Holy Quintet was either totally dishonest or totally inconsistent, totally ignorant, actually, when they make this statement, and I quote, this is page 22, the principal purpose, talking about of the Defense of Marriage Act, is to impose inequality not for other reasons like governmental efficiency. And that's a lie. And anybody who will be intellectually honest will have to understand that is a lie by the new Holy Quintet at the Supreme Court. The principal purpose was to protect the greatest foundational building block of any society since the dawn of mankind. The home, where a mother and father are there. A home where the species has offspring and they're nurtured by a mother and father. Now, certainly, I saw it in the Soviet Union back in the 70s when I was there as an exchange student. I was shocked. I was actually mortified because at these daycare centers they were saying, yes, you know, the government, the children are the government's. They're the states. Seems like I saw that on NBC recently, but they're saying they're the states. And the parents are only the brief caregivers so long as the state allows them to take care of the state's children. But if they ever say anything inappropriate that the state finds out about, they'll yank the children out, put it with somebody more deserving. I was mortified because even in the 70s, you know, I realized as a young person that, wow, the family is so important. Some of our greatest people have come from single-parent homes, and that will also continue. Thank God, since we've now passed over 40%, heading toward 50% of individuals being born today to a single-parent home. But that's not statistically the most secure and the best home in which, statistically, generally speaking, for a child to grow up. Obviously, there are exceptions. You have abusive parents. You had parents that I sent to prison who were an aberration to have in anybody's home. So I sent them to prison for committing crimes. Well, obviously, a two-parent home where one of them is committing crimes is not healthy to a child. But overall, for the history of this country, the states, members of Congress, the original founders, they would never have dreamed we would get to a point where the judiciary, the unelected branch, the only unelected branch, would say, we're going to rewrite the laws of nature and nature's God. but that's in essence what they say. Page 25, the court says the federal statute is invalid for no legitimate purpose. Overcomes the purpose in effect to disparage and injure those whom the state, by its marriage laws, sought to protect in personhood and dignity. That's a tragic decision. And it's heartbreaking that it will help degenerate this society as we move forward, fewer and fewer people paying income tax, as this society becomes more and more narcissistic, more focused on ourselves. How else can you explain one generation saying, this generation is so valuable that we are going to force future generations, some who have not even been born, to pay for our narcissism and to our engorging ourselves on the money of future generations. We're the first in American history that's ever been so self-absorbed. And it's heartbreaking. We've got to change this. All the generations before had the majority of that generation, that we will sacrifice whatever we have to so that our children will have a better nation than we have. I've been the beneficiary of that. And I will work till I take my dying breath to try to change the direction we're headed toward national bankruptcy, both financially and morally. But this is a disingenuous opinion, and either the court realizes it, which makes it dishonest, or they don't realize it, and it makes them very ignorant. So, nonetheless, when I finished reading that majority opinion, I knew, well, surely, as bad as that opinion is, incorporating things that simply aren't true, disingenuous, when they take up the Proposition 8 case from California, number one, they'll have to say that the people that pushed through the law and passed it have standing to defend the law that they pushed through and passed and voted for themselves by referendum, just as the members of Congress were allowed to have standing to defend the bill. In California's case, the executive branch, their Attorney General, refused to defend the law that was passed by a majority of the Californians. And so I thought, okay, well, that'll be an easy one for the Supreme Court. They can just reference the Windsor case, as these people have the right, they have standing, therefore we have jurisdiction to take up the merits of the case, and they could cite Windsor, the DOMA case, for the proposition, as they say in the DOMA case, that the states have a right to determine what marriage will be in their state. And here's the amazing part for people who have educations from Ivy League, many of them Ivy League institutions. I'm not sure, they may all come from Ivy League institutions. Sounds like we need some diversity on the court, though, if that's the case. They hold that the people that passed the law in California, voted for the law in California, do not have standing to defend the law. So we're not even going to take up the issue that we said clearly in the case we just decided on DOMA, that only the states have a right to decide what marriage is within their states. So they kick it back to a lower court to dismiss. It is tragic when people who are supposed to be our best educated have such false reasoning based on a fiction that the law saying marriage is a man and a woman has no other purpose, the primary purpose at least being to create inequality. That is tragic. It does not bode well for this nation when the only unelected branch decides that they will rewrite the laws of nature and nature's God. And why do I mention that? Is because those are terms that the founders used. And when my pastor, David Dykes, was up here with his wife, Cindy, it was the first time I'd gone over to the State Department. I mean, I majored in history. I loved history. I owed the Army 4 years for my scholarship at A&M. And so I enjoyed history, so I majored in it. And, you know, I knew all about the Revolution, the Treaty of Paris, but I'd never actually looked at the Treaty of Paris or a copy of it. And over under glass in the State Department building, they have an incredible copy of the original Treaty of Paris of 1783. And I was shocked by the big bold letters that start the Treaty of Paris. And I had to think about why would they start with those words? And then you put yourself back in the place of the founders, those who were negotiating with the British government in Paris to force them to recognize that the United States of America was a free and independent country, totally free of the Great Britain, and totally independent to do what it wished as its own sovereign nation. So they had to get representatives from Great Britain to sign that. Well, what would keep them from just breaking their oath? I mean, we see it here among politicians. They'll swear one thing and then they'll go do something else. What would keep the representatives of Great Britain from doing the very same thing? And the founders wanted something so profound under which they would make the Great Britain diplomats sign that they would be afraid to ever break that oath. So I thought about it. Well, what in the world would I put in the document to make them sign under? I don't think having a notary is going to quite do the trick, especially if it's an American notary. And say, well, it wasn't a British notary. But so what would you do? What would you put in the document to make them swear under? And that's where they came up with the first words of the Treaty of Paris that for the first time truly recognized the independence of the United States by Great Britain. France had already recognized us, but this was the one we've been in revolt with and war with. So the first words, the biggest, boldest words in all of the Treaty of Paris were these: in the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. Now, they knew, both the British and the Americans, that the Trinity represented the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. And they put that as the biggest words in there. In the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. They figured if the British will sign this document with those in big bold letters, they will not want to face their judge someday if they break that oath. It's the very reason that John Quincy Adams, a great advocate for abolition, the only man in American history who had been elected president, 1824, defeated in 1828, he decides God's calling him to bring an end to slavery like William Wilberforce was trying to do in England. So he did the unthinkable. After he was president, he ran to be a representative in the House of Representatives of the U.S. Congress and was elected. And it indicated to someone that he was proud of being elected to Congress after being president than he was being elected president, which seems a little strange. But then if you think about it, it means after he was elected president, his neighbors still liked him. So that was a big deal. But over and over, he preached sermons on the evils of slavery just down the hall here. But in the Amistad case that came before the Supreme Court down in what we call the old Supreme Court chamber downstairs, he argued before the Supreme Court, and you can find his whole argument online. Fortunately, they didn't put 2+ days of oral argument in the movie Amistad. Anthony Hopkins, a good Longview, Texas guy named Matthew McConaughey. He argued the case, and you find at the end of his argument, and I don't have it committed verbatim, but basically he goes through asking, where's Justice so-and-so and Chief Justice John Marshall, and where is the solicitor who last argued the case against me when I was here before? Even the judge that started this case, he had died one night during oral argument, during the days of oral arguments. And he ends up concluding, basically, they've gone to meet their judge, and the most important question that we could ask is, or that they were asked, is will they hear, well done, good and faithful servant? Now, if I'd had a lawyer argue that before me in the Court of Appeals or in the district bench, I'd gotten the message. You got a lawyer there saying, if you don't decide for me, you're going to have to face God Almighty someday, and He's going to judge you, and He's going to come down on you if you don't do the right thing in this case. And I might not have appreciated it, but the court found appropriately for John Quincy Adams' side of the case. And those free Africans were allowed to leave as free Africans, as they should have been. So back then, the lead abolitionist, he knew, he believed with all his heart, someday people are going to meet their maker. He's going to be their judge. And I might have enjoyed if John Quincy Adams were able to come back as Lazarus did when Jesus raised him and go before the Supreme Court and say, let me tell you, I've been there. You are going to go before your judge someday, and you better not pretend to be God Himself, because you're going to meet God Himself someday. But this Supreme Court did not have that benefit, so the Holy Quintet decided to rewrite the law. And I want to touch on briefly law that was just passed down the Senate. I really appreciated my good friend Senator Ted Cruz's statement down the hall. I'm quoting from his statement. Unfortunately, all of the concerns that have been repeatedly raised about this bill remain. It repeats the mistakes of the 1986 immigration bill. It grants amnesty first. It won't secure the border, and it doesn't fix our broken legal immigration system. This bill doesn't solve the problems because the process it went through was fatally flawed. It was written behind closed doors with special interests. In the Judiciary Committee, the Gang of Eight and Democrats blocked all substantive amendments because of a previously cooked deal. And on the Senate floor, the majority blocked any attempts to fix the bill. Further, in conjunction with Obamacare, the Gang of Eight bill creates a tax penalty on employers, effectively up to $5,000 for hiring U.S. citizens or legal immigrants, but that penalty does not apply to those with RPI, which is Registered Provisional Immigrant Status, giving a powerful incentive for job creators to hire illegal immigrants instead of U.S. citizens or legal immigrants. That's indefensible. Ted says, I filed an amendment to fix this defect, but was blocked by Senate Democrats from receiving a vote on that solution. Sadly, this bill won't fix the problem with our immigration system and will only encourage more illegal immigration and human suffering. Quite tragic, quite tragic. Senator Cruz explains it well. Dr. Tom Coburn, good friend, hopefully he'd acknowledge that, from Oklahoma, Senator Tom Coburn said this. I won't read the whole statement, not adequate time, but a wonderful statement. He summarized it very, very well. He said it is a $48 billion border stimulus package that grants amnesty to politicians who want to say they are securing the border when in fact they are not. On further, he quotes Reagan. He said, Reagan said it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, wind-swept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds, living in harmony and peace. A city with free ports that hummed with commerce and activity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. Walls with doors is an immigration policy that can unite our nation. But today, Democrats sound like they want only doors. Republicans want only walls. The truth is we have neither. We have chaos. Well said. But the Republicans I know want doors. We want immigration. We want the fresh water flowing into this incredible lake. It's a healthy, good thing. And I love the fact that, generally speaking, most Hispanics I know have a faith in God, a devotion to their family, and a hard work ethic. That's what I think made America great. It's a great thing. We need more of that. That's a good thing. But it has to be done legally. And it's heartbreaking that this got pushed through the Senate to what many of us believe will be the detriment of this country. In the Weekly Standard, John McCormick wrote an article that 5 senators who support the immigration bill don't know the answer to a key question about it. Great article there in the Weekly Standard. There are plenty of good articles that, if our friends down the hall had bothered to read them. Eagle Forum's got a great article, great newsletter on the Gang of Eight and what they've done to America. What my friend Ted Cruz was pointing out, under Obamacare there is a penalty that could be $3,000 per employee for those over 50. You deduct 30, it's a formula. But basically, most cases, it's a $2,000 penalty for any employer that has over 50 employees that does not provide the level of health care that is required under Obamacare. And so Ted Cruz makes a point I hadn't heard anybody else make. That's an excellent point, that under Obamacare, if you're an employer and you've got 1,000 people working for you, certainly you're under Obamacare, so you're either going to pay a tax on $2,000 per person on your employees if you don't give them the highest level required of health insurance, and so they will end up being under Obamacare. Well, businesses compete to stay in business, and if someone else has a lower overhead, then they have to try to get down to that level of overhead. Well, under the Senate bill, they create these registered provisional immigrants, and by that law, the registered provisional immigrants are not under Obamacare. So, if an employer that has, say, 1,000 employees wants to save $200,000 or so, that employer can fire all of the American citizens and all the legal immigrants that he has working in that manufacturing plant and hire the RPIs, the registered provisional immigrants. And then that employer doesn't have to provide them health care, and he doesn't have to pay the $2,000 fine per employee. Save a couple of $100,000. If you got 10,000 employees, then you would save a couple of $1 million. Really profound, the detrimental effect it will have to legal immigrants and American citizens. And I see that my dear friend from Minnesota, Ms. Bachman, is here. How much time do I have remaining?
The gentleman has 2 minutes.
I yield those 2 minutes to my friend from Minnesota.
I want to thank